Welcome back to Reacteria, everybody. I'm gonna be honest with you, this episode takes a turn that I did not expect it to take when I started it, so buckle in, it's gonna be a wild ride. I was recently asked to respond to an interview with Dr. Stephen Meyer from the Discovery Institute on the Joe Rogan Experience. Now, I've responded to a clip from Stephen Meyer before on this channel. He's a creationist whose favorite trick is to liken DNA to computer code.
The chemical subunits that run along the interior of the twisting double helix molecule, they're called nucleotide bases. He said that these bases are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or like the zeros and ones, the digital characters that we use in software today. The chemical subunits that run along the interior of the famed double helix, they're called bases or nucleotide bases. He realized that they were functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like zeros and ones in a section of software.
If you want to give your computer a new functionality, a new function, what do you have to give it? And of course they knew. Code. You have to give it information. And the same thing is true in life.
And say that because computer code has to come from a programmer, DNA has to come from God.
So when we see information in a digital form in software, or we see a paragraph in a book, we see information in a software program, or in a hieroglyphic inscription, or a paragraph in a book, or information embedded in a radio signal, information, whether inscribed in hieroglyphics, written in a book, or encoded in a radio signal, and we trace that information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process.
And we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, always arises from an intelligent source. It does indeed take intelligence to generate informational sequences. Information, especially in an alphabetic or digital form, always comes from an intelligent source. The creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. Systems with digital information invariably arise from intelligence.
And when we see that information is the foundation of life,
that is to say, the kind of information present in DNA,
the discovery of information at the foundation of life, we can infer that the best explanation for the origin of that information is in fact also a mind.
Is also a striking appearance of design.
Provides strong grounds for inferring that a designing intelligence played a role in the origin of life.
And because you can't randomly change computer code to make better software, you can't randomly change DNA to make better organisms.
Random changes in a section of functional code or functional information is going to degrade that information long before you ever get to something fundamentally new. Information in DNA is also essentially typographic or digital, and there are far more ways to go wrong in arranging those characters than there are ways to go right. If you're a computer programmer, you know that if you start randomly changing the sections of functional code, you're going to degrade that code long before you ever come up with a new program or operating system. And the same thing applies in the biological case, because the information in DNA is essentially digital or typographic. There are far more ways to arrange those A's, C's, G's, and T's along the DNA molecule that will result in gibberish than will result in functional information capable of building a new protein.
All statements that can be easily and thoroughly debunked by anybody who knows anything about either computer programming or evolution. Now, I'm not going to watch this full episode of the Joe Rogan Experience for so many reasons, chief among them being that I just super don't want to. But I did search YouTube for a clip from this show where Stephen Meyer is specifically talking about evolution, and that is where our adventure is going to begin today. But before we get started, I want to say thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Every single one of you has a special place in my heart and my spleen. And I want to say thank you to the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN. You want to hear about safe internet? NordVPN is the longest running sponsor on this channel. They were my very first sponsor, and so far they've sponsored more of my videos than anyone else. And today I'd like to say thank you by also letting them sponsor this video too. Nord is more than just a VPN service. It also blocks out malware and intrusive ads, and Nord's threat protection service is always on, even when your VPN is turned off. So if you've ever been curious about what a VPN is, or how one works, or why seemingly every channel is promoting one, NordVPN is a great way to start exploring. They have so much to offer, and if you go to nordvpn.com/ValkaiLabs, you'll get a massive discount off of a 2-year plan, plus an additional 4 months free, all with a 30-day money-back guarantee. It is literally the best way to try this stuff out. And in case you weren't already sold on the value here, one single account with NordVPN allows you to connect up to 6 different devices. So you could have 6 different screens all routing their internet through servers in completely different countries, all so that you can watch 6 of my videos at the same time. This nightmare could be yours! So head on over to nordvpn.com/ValkaiLabs, get a massive discount off of a 2-year plan plus an additional 4 months free, and if you don't like it for any reason, get your money back within the first 30 days. It's a risk-free way to help you and help the channel. Thanks so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this video, and now let's see if Stephen Meyer has anything new to say.
Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in, I believe in microevolution. I believe that there are real evolutionary processes. I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor.
So immediately, he's attempting to split hairs between microevolution and macroevolution. We've talked about these terms before, but remember, microevolution is small genotypic changes within a population of one species, and macroevolution is large phenotypic changes above the species level that we see throughout the fossil record. Macroevolution is caused by microevolution. But unfortunately, even though those are actual biological terms, they're so loaded that there are lots of people out there that believe that they are only creationist terms. So by eschewing the word macroevolution for the phrase universal common descent, he's making this whole argument just a little bit more palatable for the people watching who might not already be creationists. And in my experience of doing call-in shows and whatnot where we talk to creationists, that kind of language is a lot more effective than phrases like macroevolution, because now all of a sudden, this is personal. We're not just talking about dinosaurs and fossils and stuff. We're talking about universal common descent. That means that you came from a fish. What? And it also sounds a lot harder to prove, because while these big changes in the fossil record are undeniable to anybody who's ever seen the fossil record, how can these scientists know what the family trees of animals that lived 10 million years ago actually looked like? How can they really prove that all life is related? Genetics. Genetics is how we prove that. And also homology and embryology and also just logic, but mainly genetics.
I'm profoundly skeptical about chemical evolution, the idea that the non-living chemicals in a prebiotic ocean or prebiotic soup arrange themselves to form the first living cell.
So again, the word choice is incredibly important. Chemical evolution is the formation of complex organic molecules from simple inorganic molecules through natural processes. It's something that we not only have tremendous amounts of evidence for, but it's something that we've literally watched happen in laboratory settings. What he's talking about, non-living chemicals arranging themselves to form the first living cell, that's abiogenesis, and that's a totally different thing. And it may seem like I'm being overly nitpicky here, like we all know what he meant, right? But the problem with him conflating these two terms is that it makes the whole process seem a lot more fantastical than it actually is. It would be like me describing the invention of computers as a pile of metal being arranged in such a way that it can do math. That's technically not wrong, but it's certainly not going to inspire any confidence about the potential of computing. The truth is, when you talk about chemical evolution and abiogenesis, if you just dig a little bit into our actual understanding of all of this stuff, it becomes a lot harder to just gloss over it the way that he just did. So we're going to do that now. Follow along with me, because there's a lot of vocab coming up, but it's not nearly as difficult as it sounds, and we're only going to cover the most essential parts, okay? There are 4 major macromolecules that make up life, and those are proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Proteins are made from amino acids. There are about 20 of those that are essential for life on Earth, but there are many, many more of them that are possible. Lipids are made of a couple different things, but mainly what are called fatty acids, which generally look like long chains of carbon atoms surrounded by hydrogen atoms with what's called a carboxyl group on the end. Carbohydrates are made of sugars, and just like with amino acids, there are lots and lots of different kinds of sugars that can all go together to make a carbohydrate. One sugar molecule by itself, like glucose, fructose, or ribose, is called a monosaccharide, meaning one sugar. 2 sugars connected together, like lactose, sucrose, or maltose, is called a disaccharide, literally 2 sugars. And 3 or more sugars connected together, like glycogen, cellulose, or starch, is what we call a polysaccharide, which means many sugars. The blanket term for any one of those things is carbohydrate. And finally, there's the nucleic acids. Those are DNA and RNA in all of their various forms. Now, just like with lipids, nucleic acids are made of a couple of different things, but the most important part is what we call their nitrogenous bases. Those are the letters of your genetic code. And overall, there are 5 of those: adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. So to recap, there are 4 major macromolecules that make up all life on Earth. And each of those macromolecules has a unique subunit, a specialized building block that makes up that one thing. And here's the final nail in the coffin for anybody who doesn't believe in chemical evolution. We have found all of those subunits in space. We've found sugars, we've found fatty acids, we've found around 70 different kinds of amino acids, remember only 20 are necessary, and we've found all 5 nitrogenous bases. So while some people may be skeptical of the chemical evolution experiments taking place here on Earth, there's nobody up there in space tweaking the knobs or fudging the numbers. The only reasonable explanation for finding those molecules in space is that they self-assembled in space. Now, as for how those building blocks got started as life, that's a totally different story. That's what astrobiologists study, and they've made a ton of really exciting progress on that question over the past couple of decades. And even though we've still got a little ways left to go, as it stands, if we were to reduce the entire process from the most basic, simple, inorganic molecules all the way up to self-replicating, evolving life down to like 10 rhetorical steps, we would have steps 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 10. And creationists like Meyer like to pretend that not knowing step 4 or step 9 is the same thing as just not knowing anything about this at all, which he has a doctorate in the philosophy of science. He knows why you shouldn't do that. But most importantly, when you learn about the history of discovery in both chemical evolution and astrobiology, it makes you realize that creationists have been using this exact same argument about step 3 before we knew what step 3 was. And then we learned what step 3 was, and so they moved on to step 4. And it kind of makes you wonder, what are they going to do in just a couple of decades when we've filled in the rest of the gaps of our knowledge? But actually, people like Meyer answer that question for you all the time. Anytime we don't know something, you don't have any evidence for it, it's not provable, therefore God. And anytime we do know something, it's all too perfect and intricate, and it clearly shows design, therefore God. The point is, there's still lots of things we don't know about the universe. There are tons of unanswered questions in chemistry, in physics, and astronomy, and biology. That's what makes science so exciting. That's what gives it the potential that it has. But what kills that excitement, and what squashes that potential, is taking the stance that just because we don't know something already, the only reasonable explanation is magic.
And I'm also skeptical about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, which, as it happens, so are many leading evolutionary biologists today. I attended a conference in 2016 at convened by the Royal Society, and it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks, and many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution.
It's no secret that neo-Darwinian theory alone can't account for everything that we see in evolution. That's where things like epigenetics and neo-Lamarckian evolution come in. Now, as for this meeting, I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure what was or wasn't discussed, but I'm pretty confident that the leading evolutionary biologists in the world didn't all gather together to talk about how evolution doesn't make any sense. If I had to hazard a guess, I would bet good money that when they said we need a new theory of evolution, what they were actually saying is we need a new model to unify all these different things that we now know about evolution and all these different evolutionary mechanisms all together into one new theory, not macroevolution isn't real.
The mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing forms. It can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms. Think about, for example, Darwin's finch beaks. Great job of explaining how variations in weather patterns result in changes in the shape and structure of the finch beaks. But that mechanism turns out not to do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or other major animal groups in the first place. So modification, yes. Innovation, no.
So this is an argument that we've come up against before. The idea that the modification of beaks, for example, doesn't explain the evolution of birds, and therefore the whole evolutionary model is somehow lacking. This makes no sense for several reasons. First of all, as we talked about back when Kevin Anderson made this exact same argument, of course the modification of a gene doesn't tell you a lot about the generation of a gene, or the generation of a whole clade for that matter. By looking at gene modification, you're not asking questions about those other things, so you shouldn't expect to find an answer. Secondly, even if we didn't have any understanding on the formation of new genes or indeed new clades, which we super do, by the way, that wouldn't be any reason to be distrustful of the evolutionary model as a whole. That would be like saying if we didn't know how the Earth formed, there would be no reason to believe in plate tectonics. Just because you don't understand the origins of a thing doesn't mean that you can't learn about the present dynamics of that thing. Third, the only difference between any two organisms, no matter what taxa, is their DNA. So if a gene is modified or duplicated or deleted within a population, that population is now going to be a slightly different flavor of organism than the rest of their species. And if those changes were to take place far upstream in a long genetic pathway, you could dramatically change the phenotypic geography of a whole population of organisms practically overnight. Fourth, taxonomy is not an immutable thing. Nature is what nature is, and our job as scientists is just to look for patterns in nature and draw little boxes around them. Just because the box around birds is where it currently is, doesn't mean that nothing ever could have transitioned into or could ever transition out of that box. This is important to remember because creationists like to pretend that our human-made classification systems are like these eternal truths of the universe, and they just aren't. In fact, the discovery of things that defy or destroy our classification systems has kind of been the driving force of science for the past few centuries. And finally, fifth, we do have an explanation of where birds come from. They evolved from avian dinosaurs. That's not exactly a mystery. And even if we didn't have a functional mechanism to explain that, all of the fossil and genetic and morphological evidence all points in that same direction. So we would still know what happened even if we didn't know how. So to have him sitting here suggesting that evolution is this vapid idea that lacks explanatory power, and all these biologists are just sitting around trying to figure out a reason to believe it, is pretty silly.
But modification over massive amounts of time, don't you think that would eventually lead to new groups? Because a lot of new groups have similar origins, or at least origins from one ancestor.
I just want you to stop and appreciate the fact that Joe Rogan is the most reasonable person in the room right now. That should tell you something.
Well, time,
like primates.
Yeah, time was always the hero of the plot. But let me just run a couple of arguments by you, and let's see what you think. Okay, we now know, thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have to have new code.
Can you hear it coming?
So you need new anatomical structures, but the new anatomical structures require new cell types. So anytime you want to get it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code.
You know what he's about to say, don't you?
In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system. You can change a few things and still retain function, but after a very few number of changes, you're going to degrade the function, and long before you come up with a new function.
And there it is. As I said back in the beginning of the video, Stephen Meyer loves this argument. It's one of his favorite arguments to make, and he makes it almost everywhere that he goes. It's an incredibly easy argument to debunk. If you think about it for more than 2 seconds, it completely falls apart. And yet he keeps on saying it as if his logic is rock solid and his reasoning is completely unassailable. Now, because I already thoroughly addressed this argument in this video, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about it here, but if I had to pick out just one major issue with this whole line of thinking of comparing DNA to computer code, it would be that computers don't reproduce. If a computer code suddenly underwent several major changes, then it would almost certainly be a problem. Similarly, if one organism suddenly had several major changes to its DNA, it would probably be a problem. But those aren't accurate comparisons to how evolution works, and they especially don't make any sense when you're trying to critique evolution. And you have to add so much to this analogy just to barely bridge that gap. Like, you have to assume that each computer is going to make like 10 more computers, each with an exact copy of its code. Only some of the copies have like slight differences to the code, either just like a little bit or maybe a lot, and that some of those differences actually do make the computer run worse, and some of the differences make the computer run better, and some of the differences are imperceptible and they don't actually change anything. And also that every single person that buys one of those computers like knows everything about computers, and so they're able to tell like how those tiny changes actually add up. And so I guess like the worst computers have like a lower market value or something, and then like after like the next generation of computers, like the ones that were getting better, you also have some of those that are even more better still, and then like the ones that had an imperceptible change, those changes then have more changes that can like compound with the old imperceptible ones to make them run like high-end software better or something. Also remember, in real evolution, when something gains fitness in one environment, it necessarily loses fitness in another environment. This is why evolution has no peak, because when a cactus becomes better adapted for life in the desert, it is simultaneously becoming worse adapted for life underwater. So for this analogy to make even a little bit of sense, we would have to assume that whenever a computer becomes better at streaming, it's also becoming worse at like word processing. And similarly, there's the issue of what we call antagonistic pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is when a single gene has multiple different effects. So antagonistic pleiotropy is when a mutation to that gene has some beneficial effects on one trait and some deleterious effects on another trait. So a great example of this is how almost all mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae. You have 7 bones in your neck, and so do giraffes. That big long neck contains exactly 7 giant bones. And what's wild is that for some reason, the genes that code for that are tangled up in such a way that if you change that even just a little bit, you have massive health ramifications. Fetuses with an abnormal number of cervical vertebrae are significantly more likely to be stillborn. And babies that survive being born with an abnormal number of cervical vertebrae are 120 times more likely to develop pediatric cancer. So even though having more or less than 7 cervical vertebrae could provide an adaptive advantage to some mammals, it comes at a significant fitness cost. And that's why there's only 2 kinds of mammals, sloths and manatees, that have more or less than 7 bones in their necks. Sloths have 10 and manatees have 6, and that's it. And if you think about what those 2 types of animals have in common, they both have exceedingly slow metabolisms, and low metabolic rates are linked to low rates of cancer. So that's the evolutionary trade-off that they had to make in order to get the weird necks that they have. And it's the same thing with any animal that has wings instead of arms, or fins instead of feet, or any other strange body plan. They had to make an evolutionary trade-off to get there, and there are several important steps that go into that. So if you want to go forward with Stephen Meyer's brainless computer analogy, you can't just talk about the code itself. You also have to assume that every time a computer gets like a better graphics card, it also has to like lose some RAM or something. It's just, you have to add so much to this analogy to make it even barely functional with actual biology. And it's so frustrating because it hinges on this idea that you can't make random changes to a computer code to make the computer code better, which is demonstrably untrue. But then also because of that, you can't just make changes to DNA to make an organism better, which is also demonstrably untrue. Like, it's wild how much I've had to talk about computers recently. We even had to talk about it in the last Answers in Genesis video. This is like the most shallow form of thinking about evolution that it's possible to have. And yet we hear this analogy over and over and over, and the analogy falls apart as soon as it's even said, because animals are not fucking computers.
Mutations are within limits. You can modify again. You can optimize an existing protein structure called a fold. But if you allow too many of those mutations, you're going to degrade. And long before you would get a fundamentally new protein structure, another protein fold.
It's genuinely wild to me that Stephen doesn't seem to understand that you can use the same genes and proteins and cells and tissues for different things. You don't have to worry about making new genes or degrading a protein, which that's a whole bag of dishonest nonsense in and of itself, or coming up with novel features or whatever other thing he's talking about here, if you just use the materials that are already present for a new purpose. Change their use, not their fundamental structure. So for example, since we were talking about birds earlier, birds have both scales and feathers. And scales and feathers are both made of keratin, the same protein, just in different arrangements. Just like how diamonds and graphite are both made of carbon in different arrangements. One single point mutation, one single letter change to the DNA of a bird causes them to grow feathers where they would normally be growing scales. It causes the same protein to arrange itself in totally different ways. And even the feathers that they grow all over their body normally are caused by the same kind of mutation, causing the same keratin to produce feathers instead of scales in those places. And the flight feathers that allow birds to fly today are just a modified form of the insulating feathers that dinosaurs had 200 million years ago. It's the same keratin, produced by the same keratinocyte cells, produced by the same genes, just being modified again and again and again to do different stuff. And yet here you have Stephen saying that just modifying things doesn't tell you how we got those things in the first place, when he's describing the way that we got those things in the first place. It's madness. Also, can we talk about the fact that Stephen started this whole diatribe by saying that he was merely skeptical of evolution? I would have no problem with him being skeptical of evolution. I encourage everyone to be skeptical of everything. My favorite t-shirt says question everything. I try to promote skepticism in everything that I do. But that is not what Stephen is doing. Stephen isn't just following the evidence, asking probing questions, trying to learn more about this whole situation and critiquing what he finds. No, what he's doing is dogmatically rejecting evolution and attempting to horn in creationism, both of which are very unskeptical things to do.
So that's just one of many. I want to run one other argument by you that I think is very intuitive. If you want to build, it turns out that there are structures or systems for building that are very important for building new animal body plans. And they're called developmental gene regulatory networks. You not only have genes for building proteins, you have genes that are building molecules that send signals that tell the genome when to express other parts of itself, when to turn this part or that part on in order to build the right proteins at the right time as new cells are going through cell division in the process of animal development. And all of this is closely choreographed by these signaling molecules. So you get DNA that builds regulatory RNA that turns on another part of the DNA that then turns on, that builds a protein for servicing a particular type of cell at the right time and not at another time.
Case in point about not being skeptical, here we are again with the argument from personal incredulity. These gene regulatory networks are just so long and complicated and intricate and complex that there's no way that they possibly could have arisen by random chance. Which ignores two major points. Number one, yes, these gene regulatory networks are quite long and complicated, but when you look at any one part of them, they're actually quite simple and intuitive. And number two, just because they look complicated now doesn't mean that they were always that way or that they just suddenly started being that way. They would have gotten a little bit more complicated at a time over a long period of time, just like everything else. And what's especially frustrating about that is something that I already mentioned a little while ago. He's talking about these gene regulatory networks, these long genetic cascades that are really important for lots of things, but he's not connecting the dots that if you have all of these genes in sequence and one triggers the next like dominoes, then you could make a simple little tiny mutation up here and have big major ramifications down here. And then you could have major phenotypic changes happening very fast, which is what he's saying he doesn't believe in. And finally, if I've said this once, I've said it a million times, but it's worth repeating again and again and again. even if you could completely debunk evolution, and we threw away the entire theory and we had no explanation for biodiversity, you still wouldn't have done one single thing to back up your belief in creationism. X equals 0 is not the same as Y equals 1. That is not how science works. But of course, Stephen Meyer doesn't care how science works. He's just here to make an argument for his God. And that's why all of his scientific critiques of evolution wouldn't work the same way if you were to turn them around on him. This genetic pathway is so mind-blowingly complex, there's no way evolution could have come up with it. This genetic pathway is so mind-blowingly complex, there's no way God could have come up with it. Both of those arguments mean nothing, and yet I guarantee this dude would have very different responses to them. Having said all that, I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm just a dude and Stephen Meyer is just a dude, and you watching this might be a little bit on the fence about which dude to believe. But if you recall, at the beginning of this video, Stephen said that he attended a conference held by the leading evolutionary biologists in the world, and what they said at that conference supported the conclusions that he's putting forth here. Now, I cut this part out earlier, so you wouldn't have to hear it twice, but he actually did mention one scientist and one presentation in particular.
The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, and he simply enumerated the 5 major what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism.
Now that sounds pretty damning for evolution, especially in the context of this whole clip. But we've done about 20 episodes of this series so far. And even back in episode 1, we were dealing with creationists who were misquoting and misrepresenting and twisting and distorting what real scientists were saying in order to make it sound like the people who study and teach evolution for a living didn't believe that it was real. And I caught a strong whiff of that same dishonesty coming off of that story. So I wrote to Dr. Müller, the emeritus professor of evolutionary biology that Stephen just cited as his justification for distrusting the whole process of natural selection, and I asked him what he thought of this interview. He gave me permission to read this response. I expected that it would be easy to point out how Meyer is misrepresenting the arguments I gave in my Royal Society lecture, but he doesn't actually misquote me. He speaks about our dissatisfaction with neo-Darwinism and the explanatory shortcomings of the conventional mutation selection mechanism. How this does a good job at fine-tuning and optimizing existing forms by generating small-scale variation, but does a poor job of explaining the origin of the forms that undergo variation. If one wouldn't know what his true intentions were, one could believe that he is an evolutionist himself. Of course, he is using the Royal Society meeting and my lecture to indicate that even conventional evolutionary biologists disagree about the mechanisms of evolution, in order to sow doubt about biological evolution itself. But disagreements about the theory of how evolution works do not call the facts of biological evolution into doubt. This is where most intelligent design advocates make a jump in their argument that is simply not warranted. Having said this, it is obvious that Meyer makes many mistakes in his representation of evolution, which could be part of the reason why he thinks evolution cannot be true, besides his religious beliefs, which no one will be able to change. He says that if you want to build a new form of life, you always have to have new code first. No. New anatomical structures require new cell types. No. For a new function, you also have to provide new code. No. Etc. But especially his computer analogy is most definitely wrong. Because random changes in computer code cannot lead to a new digital function or operating system, since the digital code degrades long before this would happen, he believes that random changes in DNA must also be deleterious. He says, quote, "It's like in a computer world." No, it is not. And based on the experience in the computer world, one would expect that degradation will also happen with biological code, and therefore evolution by random mutation and selection cannot be true. In the end, he mentions gene regulatory networks, but stops short of making the obvious argument that with mutations in these gene regulatory networks, you don't need so many random mutations to create an important change of the phenotype. In a sense, Meyer argues like a gene reductionist, and then concludes that this doesn't work, and consequently, evolution by natural means must be wrong. This, of course, is very different from our argument, which doesn't assume that mutation and selection don't take place in evolution, but that for the creation of specific complex phenotypes, e.g. morphological novelties, other mechanisms are causally responsible, like cellular physics, dynamics of multicellular interaction, tissue self-organization, topological factors, etc. In our scenario, the function of genetic evolution is to harness generically originating structures by streamlining and fixating the molecular mechanisms that faithfully reproduce them in subsequent generations. So in the section of the interview that I can access, Meyer is quite careful not to misquote me. But of course, he doesn't use my criticism of the standard theory in the sense that it was intended. It sounds like if Dr. Meyer is going to continue to attend these conferences, he might want to start taking better notes. Now we're just about done with Stephen Meyer for this video, but there is just one more important thing to talk about before we move on. In case you weren't aware, Stephen Meyer is one of the co-founders and is still one of the directors of the Discovery Institute, an organization which brands itself as being scientific, calling itself a nonpartisan, nonprofit focused on research, but which also plainly stated in a leaked internal document from the 90s called The Wedge that their main goals are to defeat scientific materialism, replace materialistic understandings with theistic ones, make intelligent design the dominant perspective in science, and to see their theology permeate our religious, cultural, moral, and political lives. A statement that they originally denied making, but then also later defended in another publication called The Wedge Document, So What? By saying, of course they want to destroy materialism, because materialism has been the cause of all manner of genocide and eugenics and other atrocities throughout history, and no one has ever done anything like that in the name of religion. So anytime you hear Stephen Meyer talk about his humble and honest skepticism, just remember that his motivations are patently unscientific, that his goal is to push his worldview above all else, and that he is literally helping to lead an organization that is working to instill theocracy. But that's not where this video ends. In fact, we're not even close. If you remember back at the beginning, I said this video takes a crazy turn. This is where it is. Because you see, while I was putting together this video about Stephen Meyer, something happened that related to this video in a really weird and unexpected way. And it might just give you a little scare. Just a couple months short of the Halloween season. It's really important, but it's going to take me a little while to get there, so bear with me. Here we go. Here we see Dr. Stephen Meyer giving the exact same terrible arguments that we just heard in a video from PragerU titled Evolution from Bacteria to Beethoven.
In November 2016, I attended a conference in London convened by some of the world's leading evolutionary biologists. The purpose? To address growing doubts about the modern version of Darwin's theory. Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program. For computers to run faster and perform more functions, they require new code. Well, the same is true for life. But this raises questions about the creative power of natural selection and mutation. Scientists who know about these problems are not ignorant, stupid, or insane. They are just appropriately skeptical.
Now, what is PragerU? PragerU is, in their own words, a conservative nonprofit that is focused on changing minds through the creative use of digital media. And, again, in their own words, offer a free alternative to the dominant left-wing ideology in culture, media, and education. They are a conservative organization who is working to spread conservative ideas. They are, by their own admission, politically motivated and biased. And that's fine. They are allowed to be that. But when you remember that, it comes as no surprise that they also have videos like these.
Statues of great historical figures, like Robert E. Lee, are being torn down across America. Here are some facts about Lee that remind us why his statue should remain. After 30 years of military service, Lee led U.S. Marines to crush the attempted slave rebellion by radical abolitionist John Brown in October 1859. Lee deemed slavery a moral and political evil in any country, but considered it a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, since blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa. After 4 years as Confederate commander, Lee became an icon of reconciliation upon his surrender. As president of Virginia's Washington College, he favored education for freed slaves but opposed their right to vote.
I didn't edit that unfairly. That was not a video about the history of Robert E. Lee. That was a video about why we should still have statues honoring Robert E. Lee. And the arguments that they gave were that he squashed a slave rebellion, that he said that slavery was worse for white people than it was for black people, that he said that slaves were better off as slaves in America than free in Africa, and that he opposed the right of freed slaves to vote. That's their actual video.
Today we are told that male and female are one and the same. This denial of male-female differences has led to the astonishing belief that men and women are not born male or female. They are whatever gender they say they are.
So we're starting off strong by conflating sex and gender, but go on.
Men and women are inherently different. No amount of peer-reviewed papers from gender studies departments can change this.
She literally just said, no amount of peer-reviewed research will change my mind. She literally just said, no amount of peer-reviewed research will change my mind. Oh, and speaking of gender, you'll never guess what they think about gender roles and feminism and all that good stuff.
Feminism is a mean-spirited, small-minded, and oppressive philosophy that can poison relations between the sexes. Feminism has made both men and women less happy and less free.
Here's a secret that every woman knows. Women want real men. Men they can count on and, yes, look up to. No amount of feminist theory will change that.
And of course, even though they call themselves a university, they think that real colleges and universities are leftist indoctrination centers.
It's appalling that, in the 21st century, there is still so little diversity on American college campuses. The diversity I'm talking about is diversity of thought. People expressing different points of view on an issue. At most colleges today, that's a dangerous, revolutionary idea if that different point of view is not on the left. The moment you enter college, you enter an indoctrination center.
Now that's funny, but it'll be funnier in a minute, I promise. But in the meantime, you didn't think they'd miss the opportunity to push religion too, did you?
The conclusion that God exists doesn't require faith. Atheism requires faith. It takes faith to believe in everything coming from nothing. It takes only reason to believe in everything coming from God.
And look, it's Stephen Meyer again.
What if the scientific atheists are just wrong? That raises a hopeful possibility that we are not the product of blind, pitiless indifference, but instead that we were made on purpose, that we were intended.
And he even teaches about the Big Bang.
But if the physical universe of matter, energy, space, and time had a beginning, it becomes extremely difficult to conceive of a physical or material cause for the origin of the universe. Whatever did cause the universe to exist would need to be immaterial and exist beyond space and time. To many scientists and philosophers, all this sounds an awful lot like the first words of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Because remember, it's not just that science is wrong, and it's not just that intelligent design is right. It always lands back on their specific theology being right. Now that's all terrible, but it's not the scary part. We haven't gotten to the scary part yet. First, we gotta talk about their kids channel. Did I mention they have a kids channel? They have a kids channel. And let me tell you, Saturday Night Live could not have written a funnier skit about the blatant indoctrination of children. And if you think I'm being a little bit harsh with that word indoctrination, here's the founder and namesake of PragerU, Dennis Prager, speaking at the Moms for Liberty Joyful Warriors National Summit just this year.
On the way into the hotel tonight, I want you to know I was greeted by many people. I was cursed out by about a dozen. And so I looked at them as they yelled, "F you, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi," and other epithets. And I said, I'm just curious, what evidence do you have that I am that awful a human being? All I heard was, well, because you indoctrinate kids. And which is true. We bring doctrines to children. That's a very fair statement. I said, but what is the bad of our indoctrination?
So I just want to recap here. This is an openly politically motivated organization that calls themselves a university despite having no accreditation whatsoever, and calls what they do indoctrination. And just a minute ago, they accused actual colleges and universities of being politically motivated indoctrination centers. I can't make that any funnier than it already is.
The moment you enter college, you enter an indoctrination center.
All I heard was, well, because you indoctrinate kids, which is true. We bring doctrines to children.
An indoctrination center.
You indoctrinate kids, which is true.
Indoctrination.
Indoctrinate.
Indoctrination.
Which is true.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
That's a very fair statement.
So again, when I call the kids' videos you're about to see indoctrination, I'm using their word, and I mean it in all the same ways that they mean it. Many of the videos from PragerU Kids follow two young children who see something on the news, then travel back in time to learn more about it from a famous historical figure. And the political messages underlying every single one of these videos is so thinly veiled, it makes VeggieTales look deep and complex.
These local activists want to abolish the police. They're claiming systematic oppression and want the U.S. system torn down.
Are they burning a car? What does abolish even mean?
Abolitionist? Let's check this out. Hi, are you an abolitionist?
I am. My name is Frederick Douglass. Welcome to 1852. Our founding fathers knew that slavery was evil and wrong, but the founding fathers made a compromise to achieve something great, the making of the United States. Slavery was part of life all over the world. It was America that began the conversation to end it.
So, Mr. Douglas, do you think we should be activists, just not radical ones?
Layla, your America where people are free and everyone is equal under the law sounds pretty great. But no place is perfect. So it's good to listen to activists who want to improve things. But they have to be willing to work inside our system. But if they are radical, you and your brother will be best served to stay away.
I think I'm just gonna worry about surviving middle school for now.
That sounds wonderful.
So here we have Frederick Douglass saying that the founding fathers knew that slavery was evil, but it was a necessary compromise to create the United States. And it took about 100 years to get rid of it because it was so prolific all around the world, but America was the first to stop it. Literally, none of which is true. Many of the founding fathers were slave owners. This was not a compromise that they made. They were participating in the evil thing. And America was far from the first country to outlaw slavery. Several other countries had outlawed it before Lincoln was even elected in 1860, let alone when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation 3 years later. But what's even more egregious about this is that you can actually read what Frederick Douglass said about this stuff. He wrote it down. In his speech about the emancipation of the West Indies on August 3rd, 1857, Douglass said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom, yet depreciate agitation, are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. It may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." From his speech on July 5th, 1852, titled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July? It is not the light that we need, but the fire. Not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake." And even after slavery was ended, on the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1866, Douglass said, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe." Maybe the video is just about a different guy named Frederick Douglass.
Some of the teachers at my school really don't like Christopher Columbus and don't think he should have a holiday, but some do.
It's the same with my teachers, and even some kids got into arguments about it today. You want us to go talk to Christopher Columbus, don't you?
Yeah!
Okay, sounds good.
The first people we met were great. The Taino. I ordered my men to treat them well.
From Yale University's Genocide Studies program. The pre-contact Taino culture occupying the island of Haiti was a well-organized communal society. The Spaniards exploited the island's gold mines and reduced the Taino to slavery. Within 25 years of Columbus's arrival in Haiti, most of the Taino had died from enslavement, massacre, or disease. I wonder what Columbus has to say about that.
I'm sorry, Mr. Columbus, but I heard at school that you spoiled paradise and you brought slavery and murder to peaceful people.
Leo?
Sorry. It's what I read and heard at school.
Caramba! Those are some accusations. The place I discovered was beautiful, but it wasn't exactly a paradise of civilization, and the native people were far from peaceful. So, these people in your time who think it was a peaceful paradise are misinformed. Or lying.
Yeah, but what about slavery?
Slavery is as old as time and has taken place in every corner of the world. Being taken as a slave is better than being killed, no? I don't see the problem. How can you come here to the 15th century and judge me by your standards from the 21st century? For those in the future to look back and do this is, well, estúpido.
Ah, yeah, no, of course. It was a different time, so there were different rules. All the cool kids had slaves, so he also had to have slaves. These are all very cool things to teach to kids, no doubt.
Hello, sir. I hear you are an energy expert. I would like to gather information from you and take new knowledge back to my family and community.
I think I can help. I'm an environmental scientist, and I've written lots of books about different energy sources. Reliable energy comes from coal, natural gas, and nuclear power plants.
So which energy sources are known as unreliable?
Those would be solar power from the sun and energy produced from windmills.
Wind and solar are renewable forms of energy, and they don't harm the environment.
Not so fast, Missy. It's true sun rays and wind don't harm the environment. The solar panels, windmills, and the batteries needed for these types of energy are all made from materials that have to be mined from the earth, cannot be recycled, and become hazardous waste.
No one ever likes to talk about that.
Unfortunately, many of the people who talk about how great they are for the environment give misleading information and leave out very important facts.
Now, PragerU wouldn't know anything about that.
What was that? Was that a bird?
Ew, gross.
Did that bird just get killed by a windmill?
Yes, it did. Like many people, Layla, you've been misled about renewable energy and their impact on the environment. Windmills kill so many birds, it's hard to track how many.
From the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's report on the top threats to birds. The average estimated anthropogenic bird deaths in the U.S. total to about 3,324,184,000 birds per year. Of those deaths, collision with wind turbines account for a total of 234,000. Meanwhile, collisions with power lines account for 25.5 million, collisions with cars account for 214.5 million, collisions with buildings account for 599 million, and domestic cats account for 2.4 billion. In fact, the only reason why the total number is in the billions at all is because of cats. If you remove cats from the equation, then the total average number is only 924.2 million.
Unsupervised domestic cats
kill so many birds, it's hard to track how many.
So maybe when PragerU comes up with a plan to get rid of cats and cars and power lines and buildings, they can also come up with a solution to get rid of wind turbines.
But that's just the start of how negative wind and solar are for our natural environment. Look around. Does this look natural to you?
I am Galileo. Because of the improvements I made to the telescope, I've been able to see farther into space than anyone, and I have observed things that go against what the church and the government scientists says.
I don't understand why leaders wouldn't want everyone to know true information.
I think it's because they're afraid of losing authority and power. Maybe that is why they want people to blindly follow and trust without having questions.
I mean, that sounds like something we can agree on. Are we finally on the same page?
Science isn't just about following rules and orders. It's about observing, having questions, and testing. You and Galileo taught me that.
That sounds great! How could that possibly be bad? I mean, it's not like they're going to conflate actual scientists thinking outside the box and using the scientific method to make science better as a whole and help everybody with just like random people deciding that they don't trust what scientists say because they think that like the government is using science as some sort of oppressive tool to try to control.
That's right, Bob. Government officials are telling Americans who have questions not to worry. Everyone just needs to follow the steps they've been given and trust the science.
Did you know that Ronald Reagan was one of our most popular presidents?
Of course I knew that.
And did you know he was California's governor before he was president?
Did you know that he started out as an actor? He starred in over 50 movies.
Yeah, and he wasn't just an actor either. He was in the military during World War II.
He was actually great at a lot of stuff. He played college football.
He was also on the swim team.
He ran track, too.
Plus, he was student body president.
And he was totally handsome.
Remember when she said she was in middle school? Remember back at the beginning when she said that she was in middle school? An adult wrote a script about a middle school girl pining after Ronald Reagan. Think about that for a minute, and then go take a shower and come back and finish the video.
Did someone say my name?
Wow, you're really President Reagan.
I'm here in Berlin to stop the communists and end the Cold War.
Oh man, all this talk about communists is making me hungry.
Well, Leo, communism makes everyone hungry. People living under communism are often poor and don't have enough money for food. That's why we have to stop it.
Oh, and don't even get me started on how much they hate communism. Or rather, how much they use communism as a scary buzzword for things like government control and squashing free speech and all these other things that are like Pavlovian triggers for people who have heard words like socialism and communism and Marxism and anarchism and terrorism and fascism on the news, and they think that they're all the same thing and they're all out to get them.
I am Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
People are getting punished just for their opinions and what they say. Look at Dad.
What has happened to Father?
He spoke at a school board meeting and questioned the education leadership. He doesn't like what's going on, and he's now getting attacked for speaking up.
Father is very brave. He is warrior for freedom. Stalin was dictator of Soviet Union. His ghost tries to hunt me.
Ooh, sneaking in through schools. Government controls everything, even your children.
That's kind of what Dad was saying during his speech.
Your education leaders are trying to silence Father for same reason Stalin threw me in Gulag. Ghost, why did you really throw me in Gulag to be punished?
Because I was afraid of losing control of my power. You were telling the truth, and I couldn't defend my bad leadership and bad ideas, so I had to shut you up. It's what us communists do.
And then there's these gems. How to embrace your masculinity or femininity, guides for boys and girls to become men and women, presented in a snappy, skit-heavy BuzzFeed style for kids and teens alike to enjoy. Now, of course, not all of their advice is completely terrible. There's some stuff in here about setting goals and standing up for yourself. But again, I don't have to do any tricky editing or take anything out of context to make these videos look bad. You want to talk about pushing gender ideology onto kids? Here's some examples of it.
Despite what some confused people think, masculinity is not toxic.
It took masculinity to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. And it takes masculinity to have a solid family and a strong country today.
So grow up and be a man. Be independent, financially and mentally. Figure out what you believe and stand by it. Don't be spineless about your convictions. And don't let other people think for you or pressure you into their beliefs. Use your own brain, your own judgment, educate yourself, and form your own convictions. Use critical thinking skills and learn how to have a healthy relationship with your authorities.
Sometimes life requires you to be strong, whether it's protecting your loved ones or moving a couch. Having strength when you need it is satisfying and useful. Use your strength in useful ways like manual labor, self-defense, or saving the damsel in distress. And be generous. Don't make a girl pay for her own meal.
Right. Be strong, have money. Got it. But what do you think their advice is for young girls? What do you think their advice is for young girls to embrace their femininity? Think about everything you've heard so far. What do you think their advice is for young girls to embrace their femininity?
Most gender stereotypes exist because they reflect the way that men and women are naturally different. And those differences aren't bad. Men and women complement each other and create a well-balanced family and community. So don't let anyone tell you it's bad to fit stereotypes.
Number 2, be positive. One of the most beautiful things God has created is a woman's smile. It can fill a room with energy and joy. Just try smiling and see how it affects the people around you. Be positive and look for the beauty in life. Appreciate creativity and aesthetics. Embrace your artistic side and the joy of making things beautiful. Make your house a home. And along the way, stay grateful and encouraging.
You've got to respect yourself. Think about it like treating yourself as someone you care about. Start taking your hygiene and fitness seriously. Don't eat too much trash food and keep your environment from being a dump. And dress well. Just make sure it's appropriate. Don't expose parts of your body that would send the wrong message about who you are. And use social media in a way that dignifies you as a woman. Don't invite the wrong kind of attention.
Don't be afraid to embrace gender stereotypes. Dress well, but modestly. Make your house a home. And don't forget to smile and be grateful. Now, finally, are you ready for the scary part? You've probably been asking yourself, what's the big deal here? Why are we talking about all this stuff? What does this have to do with Stephen Meyer besides the fact that he's just in some of these videos? Are you ready for the scary part? Because we finally made it. Here's the scary part. These videos made by PragerU, the unaccredited, unregulated, non-educational, self-described, politically motivated organization which openly publishes its intention to push conservative views and Judeo-Christian values and calls their own programming indoctrination, and is hosted by people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Candace Owens, Michael Knowles, and Stephen Meyer, who I'll remind you runs a different organization with a stated intention of bringing about theocracy, have just been approved as public school curriculum in the state of Florida. And if you're one of the people who gets mad in my comment section every time I get political in a video, take a second to consider what this actually means for public education. And while you're at it, maybe take a look at this PragerU Kids video titled Mateo Backs the Blue, in which a 13-year-old boy learns to love the police after witnessing the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. And you tell me which one of us is being inappropriately political.
In May 2020, George Floyd, a black man who resisted arrest and was held under the knee of a police officer, died while in custody. Activists claimed that the police were targeting the black community and purposefully killing unarmed black men. As the false claims of racial targeting spread, so did the anger and violence. Throughout the summer, Mateo and his family were shocked and worried as they watched on the news where neighborhoods around LA were being burned and looted. Mateo wondered, who would keep his neighborhood safe if there were less police? And what about his family's store? After all, he had just watched protesters smash store windows, steal all the merchandise, and even set the buildings on fire. He also saw videos of angry protesters blocking traffic on freeways, threatening police, and intimidating restaurant patrons. Mateo admitted that he felt sorry for Mr. Floyd's family, but he couldn't understand why rioters seemed to think that destroying other people's property helped the family feel better. The easiest thing he could do would be to say thank you to the police officers that worked in his neighborhood, and he started right then and there with Officer Suarez.
That can now be legally shown in a public school classroom. Just wait until they start making commercials and we can watch an owl teach us how many licks it takes to get to the center of a boot. Circling back to the main focus of this video, Stephen Meyer has also appeared in many other PragerU videos that I haven't shown you yet, like this one titled What is Intelligent Design?
There is simply too much information in the cell to be explained by chance alone. The probability of generating a section of DNA code capable of building just one functional protein by chance is vanishingly small.
And this 5-part series on the relationship between science and religion.
Indeed, it's no exaggeration to say that the Judeo-Christian religious tradition led directly to modern science.
And if you have children who attend public school in the state of Florida, that could very well be their actual science lesson this year.
You may still wish to dismiss the theory of intelligent design. You're free to believe whatever you like, but you'll have a hard time doing so based on the science.
Yeah, freaking boo, right? I told you this episode would get scary. To wrap up, I give the Stephen Meyer interview on Joe Rogan a science teacher challenge level 2 out of 10. Stephen's arguments are like a medium cooked steak. They are neither rare nor well done. And while he presents himself as this serious researcher who's abreast of the leading discoveries in the field and who has a unique perspective on this whole debate about evolution, in all reality, his arguments are no more well thought out or complex than the people who wrote the John and Jane series. Seriously, in this video, they make almost the exact same arguments in almost the exact same words as Stephen did in this interview. But that's how it goes with creationists. They have the same 10 canned arguments, and they just recycle them over and over and over, hoping to rope in new donors who haven't heard them before. As for Prager University, I grew up in Oklahoma, or as no one calls it, Northwest Alabama, so I've heard all of their gibberish before. Sometimes even in public schools, as the children of Florida are now going to get to. And it gives me hope to remember that I, and many like me, were able to see through the type of indoctrination that they spread, and see that their ideologies are no more rooted in reality than bryophytes are in soil. Bryophytes are plants that don't have root systems. Biology burn! And with that, I'm Forrest Valkai. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. Please exit through the gift shop on your way out, pick up one of these sweet t-shirts. Have an awesome rest of your day, and never stop learning. Bye-bye!
Stinger. Get it?